Now, here is your host, Kim Corbin.
You aren't good enough, smart enough, thin enough, or cool enough. These are the kinds of lives that our inner critics can spew if they are left unchecked. In his new book, Make Peace with Your Mind, my guest today, Mark Coleman, explains how mindfulness and compassion can free us from our inner critic, and he offers practical tools that can radically shift the way we think and feel. Mark is an inner and outer explorer who has studied mindfulness meditation practices for three decades. He holds an MA in clinical psychology and has taught mindfulness workshops and meditation retreats on 6 continents over the past 15 years. In addition to Make Peace with Your Mind, Mark is also the author of Awake in the Wild. As an unabashed nature lover, he has led wilderness meditation retreats from Alaska to Peru and enjoys nothing more than sharing his passion for integrating meditation and nature. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, Mark Coleman, and thanks for being here with me today.
Thank you, Kim. Great to be here.
I thought that a good place for us to start would be by having you share how your own mindfulness journey first began.
Well, I started meditating a long time ago in the East End of London. I was a young man, punk rocker, anarchist, angry young soul, and was very unhappy and angry and blaming everybody for the world's problems, and never really thought about looking at my own mind to see why I was really so anguished. And I happened to be living around the corner from a Buddhist center in the East End of London. And I walked in and saw that the people there were very, had a lot of presence and groundedness and centeredness. And I just thought, they have something that I need and want. And so I began my practice in the mid-'80s when meditation was still very sort of obscure and mindfulness was unheard of. And been practicing ever since. It really changed my life. It gave me a capacity to know myself and understand my mind and thoughts, and particularly helped me discern the ways that I was causing myself a lot of pain, including the ways that I was always beating up on myself with my inner critic.
Yeah, it's interesting because on my last podcast, I interviewed Brad Warner, who was also a young punk rocker when he first found Buddhism. So I'm wondering if that's a coincidence, or is there something that's about Buddhism in particular that's appealing to young people who are carrying around a lot of anger?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I have a friend, Noah Levine, who started the Dharma punks sort of scene or movement, and many punks have come into Buddhism through that. I think both of the punk scene and Buddhism, the Buddha was, considered his teaching against the stream, and going against the norm of society and expectations and privilege and whatnot. And I think punk is the same. It has a certain anti-establishment, anti-authority, trying to cut through the BS. So I think there is some similarities, and I think what Buddhism provided that, say, for me, punk didn't, was it provided a very practical, methodical path or journey to figure out, yes, there's suffering in the world, and it's one thing to be angry with it, and we can also look at the way that we're also adding and contributing to that pain through our own delusion and ignorance and acting out and whatnot.
Yeah. And how would you say that your relationship with your own inner critic has changed from back then to now?
Well, it's changed a lot. Back then it was very, very harsh. I was very hard on myself, very critical, very judgmental and unforgiving. And, through, 3 decades of both mindfulness practice and cultivating loving kindness and compassion, I would say that, my critic still, gets triggered. but, I see it clearly. I don't buy into it as much. I don't believe it. I don't give it as much attention. And I have a lot more awareness of it, and I have a lot more compassion. Instead of beating myself up for the various things that it's criticizing me for, I actually feel, more caring and kind and forgiving to myself for being human and having foibles and being vulnerable, which is often when the critic gets triggered.
And how would you define what the inner critic is exactly?
Well, the critic is that thought structure pattern in our minds, that in our psychology and our ego structure, that views ourselves with a very negative, critical, judgmental, perfectionistic lens. And Freud called it the superego, which is the part of the ego structure that is trying to manage all of our impulses and sort of asocial behavior, so that we learn to fit in and so we don't get ridiculed or rejected or hurt by our loved ones. When we were growing up, we needed it to survive, to learn how to fit into the family culture that we were in. And of course, now we're adults, we don't need that, but we internalize the voices from parents and church and authority figures. And so we carry around this voice that's always telling us we're not good enough, we failed, we messed up, we're never going to get it together. And so when we listen, the net accumulation of that voice is we feel deficient, we feel unworthy, we feel not good enough, and then all the other emotions that can come from that: sad, depressed, lonely, hopeless, etc. So it's a whole cluster of things. It's hard to pinpoint into one single thing, but it is that stream of negative, critical, self-judgmental voices for the most part.
Yeah. And do you think that the inner critic is something that most people are currently aware that they have, or is it often operating under the surface to the point that we don't even realize that it's negatively impacting us?
Yeah, I think for most people, it's just how they talk to themselves. It's just it's just the thoughts they hear every day. It's part of the living room furniture. And, some people, I think, if there's some familiarity with psychology and therapy, there might be some awareness of how harsh or critical that voice is. But I think for the most part, people don't really see it for what it is. They just think it's who they are. They think it's just what the mind does, and mostly believe it and agree with it, and quite happy to let it freely judge ourselves and judge others.
It's just kind of the norm.
Yeah, it's just become habituated to it.
And you write in the introduction to Make Peace with Your Mind that to navigate life's inner and outer storms, we need two essential skills: awareness and compassion. So would you please talk about those two skills and how they relate to the inner critic?
Yes. So for myself, when I started my meditation journey 30 years ago, I did learn, fortunately, these two skills. I learned the practice of mindfulness, which cultivates awareness and self-awareness. And I learned the practice of loving kindness, which cultivates friendliness and compassion. And, both are necessary. We need the awareness to discern and understand and clarify both what's going on in our heads, what we're thinking, the difference between, a reflective thought and a judgmental thought. We need to be able to be aware of the impact and how the judge affects us, right? So all those things are necessary through mindfulness, through self-awareness. And then we need compassion, because the whole thing is incredibly painful. It's really, to be on the receiving end of a voice that tells you every day you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're stupid, you're unlovable, you're too fat, or whatever the story is. It's painful. And so we need to both have compassion for the suffering that it brings, but also we need to have a fierceness that comes from a self-protective love to say, I don't want to listen to this. This is not useful. It's not accurate, not helpful. And so there's a way that we summon up the fierce quality of love to take care of ourselves in the face of what I would say is an aggressive, attacking voice.
And Make Peace with Your Mind came out last fall, right before the election. And for many of us, the outer storms that we've been weathering since Donald Trump was elected have been especially intense. Yeah. And I'd love to hear about your own inner process surrounding the political changes that we're all weathering.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole election cycle, the year and a half nightmare that we had to live through, was an example of the inner critic projected outwards. So the judging mind goes inwards, it goes outwards, and politics, and this certainly what's happening in U.S. politics is an example of the worst kind of outer judging, where we basically ridicule and shame and put down and be very rude and offensive to the opposing political party. Say Trump, personified that, to an nth degree. And then, that's of course carried on since the election. I think this brings it for me an important point between discernment and judgment. So, because it's very important that, people say, well, I don't want to get rid of my judging mind, because how will I be able to discriminate? I've got to make decisions, I've got to, function in an election cycle or whatever it is, or my work as a lawyer or a doctor. So, with this current political mayhem that we're in, of course we need a lot of discernment. We need to read a lot between the lines, because there's a lot of alternative facts going on that are not true, accurate, helpful, relevant. So we need to cultivate those qualities of discernment, of discrimination, of being able to evaluate and assess really clearly, all these executive orders and all these, deregulations that are coming down the pipeline, and just see how much they're, what's the true impact on people's lives and health and well-being. And the judging mind, it's very easy to sit back in your armchair and judge, and not necessarily so helpful. And we can also be judging ourselves for, I didn't do enough. I should have done more during the election. I should be doing more now. I should be more engaged. I should be on the front lines. I should be in DC protesting. Well, that may or may not be true. And, I think we do need to, for those of us on the progressive spectrum, do need to be more active and vocal and, confronting some of these, what I consider draconian deregulations and executive appointments and orders. So we're using the healthy side of the discerning mind, which is different than the judging mind, which is I think of as more personal and more attacking someone's value and worth rather than actually making an accurate assessment.
Right. And it seems like there's a lot of demonization of other people happening right now, whether it's of Donald Trump himself or the left demonizing the right and the right demonizing the left. And I'm curious what you would say about that as far as it being an effective tactic or not.
Yeah, well, I think, clearly it isn't, because what it's done is hate crimes have gone up, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, racist violence has gone up. Aggression towards women has gone up. The more we demonize, the more we judge, the more we polarize, the worse it seems to get. The more aggressive, the more hostile. Basically, because we see the other as other, and we see them as separate, and we see them as different than us, and we think of ourselves as better. And at the end of the day, we're all human, and we're all trying to figure this out. And we all have, I'd say mostly we share mostly similar values, not totally. And we clearly have different ideologies. We clearly have different ideas and views about how to enact those values. And the more that we see each other as other, then that's a breeding ground for racism and xenophobia, and allows, violence to be committed against the other because we made them other, just as what happened in the countless wars that we've had up to now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm guessing that demonizing our inner critic also doesn't work very well. And in Make Peace with Your Mind, you say that it's important for us to learn to befriend the scared, critical part of our minds that's always trying to judge us. So why is that important, and how do we begin to do that?
Yeah. So, it's important to understand why the critic does what it does. And so the critic, starting from an early age, we come into this world very vulnerable, young, impressionable, and we need the support and love and affection and goodwill of those around us. Otherwise, we die. We don't, without affection and food and love, and so that critic learns how to manage that vulnerability by making sure we fit in, and sort of shaming us when we're doing the wrong thing. And it's the same when we're adults. We're still social beings, even though we could maybe be independent and take care of ourselves. We're still very dependent on connection and love and social relationship. And so the critic feels like it needs to maintain that sense of harsh discipline and judging and shaming, because when we feel vulnerable, that's when the critic gets triggered. So when I talk about befriending the critic, I'm really pointing to befriending ourselves when we feel vulnerable. So, for example, say you're late for an important meeting at work and your boss is mad with you. That's a vulnerable situation, and so your critic is going to be on your case because you've, from its point of view, made yourself vulnerable by being late or not delivering a task on time, or maybe your partner's mad with you and you're vulnerable to maybe them leaving because they're so unhappy. The critic will activate because it reacts to the vulnerability and trying in its very distorted way, trying to protect you from vulnerability. And so we don't need to demonize the critic. We just need to see it for what it is, which is an old series of tape loops that try to use this rather harsh, critical, judging voice to get us to do what it thinks it should do in order to be loved and accepted. And then we need to bring in a more sort of adult, discerning mind that can actually reflect and see, well, what's actually really needed here, and what's useful, what's a more effective approach than actually shaming myself. Because what happens as soon as we start shaming and judging ourselves, we shut down. Just like when we're triggered, we shut down. We don't think so clearly. And so we actually end up sort of self-fulfilling, self-sabotaging ourselves because we've made ourselves less functional or operational because we're so down on ourselves.
Right. All right. In Make Peace with Your Mind, you say that over 70% of us will suffer from something called imposter syndrome at some point in our lives. And I had never heard of imposter syndrome before I read your book quite a while back, and I've seen it everywhere since then. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the imposter syndrome is that feeling we get quite often, that when we makes us feel like a fraud or a fake. So it's when you're going for a job interview, or you're trying to sell something to a client, or you're, on a date, and you're pitching something or you're pitching yourself. And deep inside, because you've been listening to the critic for a long time about not being smart or not being really lovable and not being really as nice as you try to present, then we start doubting ourselves and undermining ourselves. And so we show up at the job or the date or the presentation with a great sense of doubt in our ability, in our goodness, in our capacity, and so we start feeling like a fake. So we're in the job, and we feel like if people really knew what we were like, as in if they really knew what our critic was telling us and we believing, then we would get fired. Or if our partners really knew what we were like, and if the critic told them exactly what we were like, they would leave. So we walk around with this sense of feeling slightly fraudulent, slightly like we're faking it. And, this happens to very successful people. I quote people in the book, from people like, John Steinbeck, who said at the end of his life in one of his journals, I don't feel like I'm a writer. I don't know why people read my books. And, Einstein talked about, being an involuntary swindler towards the end of his life. And So many well-known, people, actors, politicians, people with great achievement, because we listen to this doubting voice, this always pointing out our foibles, we then believe that we're not quite who we say we are, and we feel fraudulent.
It's really refreshing to hear that those famous people, that had such success in their lives felt that way too. It just kind of goes to show that it's just a natural part of being human to have those feelings.
Yeah, I mean, Meryl Streep, she wrote about, I think it was in an interview, she said, I don't know why anybody comes to see my films. I can't even act, and she's the most Academy Award, nominated person in history. And so it doesn't matter how successful you are, it will follow you around if you believe the judging mind.
Yeah. At the very end of Make Peace with Your Mind, you offer an entire toolkit of practices that people can use to work effectively with a critic. And I thought it would be fun to just talk about a couple really quickly. And one is humor. So how do we use humor to work with our critic?
Yeah, well, humor is very, very important. I think, as I quote Wavy Gravy in the book, who says, if you don't have a sense of humor, it just ain't funny anymore. And we do need to be able to laugh at ourselves. Our minds are a little crazy. Our critic and other parts of our mind will tell us to, do one thing and then chastise us for doing it, or chastising us for not doing it. It'll tell us to get up in the morning and exercise, but also tell us to sleep in and make sure we're well rested for the day's work ahead. And so, whether we do one or the other, if we decide to sleep in one day because we're tired, and the critic masquerading as the coach says, you should rest. It's good for your brain. It's good for your work. And then we do. Then when we sleep in and we get up and we're late for work, then of course our critic is on our case, chastising us for not having gotten up, not having done our exercise or our meditation, and not having followed through on our commitments. And therefore, why aren't we a loser? So, so it's useful to hold the critic if you can, with a sense of lightness, because when we can see the humor in it, then there's a little bit of space. We're not so caught. We're not so bound by it. In the same way that when we can see it with awareness, there's also a little more space. So, yeah. And then the loving kindness practice. I can't underestimate the power of that, where we simply extending wishes of love and kindness towards ourselves rather than meanness and harshness. And so what I love about the loving kindness practice is it's also verbal. It uses words in the same way the critic uses words, and is basically expressing our deepest wishes for ourselves. And so I think it's a powerful practice, especially if people do it regularly. You can add a phrase of kindness after each judgment. So maybe you're at work and you're telling yourself, oh, that was a stupid report you just wrote, and may I be happy, you add afterwards. Or you go to a meeting and you didn't present very well, and your critic's on your case for being hopeless and presenting, and then you say to yourself, well, may I be peaceful, may I find ease. And so you're learning to actually speak to yourself with a little more care and kindness, and it's very, very helpful, very useful antidote to the negative barbs of the critic.
Yes, and I found there's so many at the end of the book that I really encourage people to get the book. First of all, it's very practical, and it's helped me so much with my own inner critic. And I can hardly believe it, but we are already out of time. So I want to encourage people to check out Mark's website at markcoleman.org. And especially, he's offering a really cool online course that's based on Make Peace with Your Mind that you can find there. And as always, if you enjoyed today's podcast, your 5-star rating and or review in iTunes would be greatly appreciated. And I'd also like to invite you to join the New World Now podcast community on Facebook, where you can stay up to date on our current discussions and episodes. And you can just search for New World Now podcast on Facebook to join the group. I'll hope to see you there and look forward to connecting on future episodes of New World Now.